Tori, just perfect. Just so everyone knows, the meeting is being recorded. Welcome to the fourth workshop in the IPA series of planned workshops to talk about a potential post-award process for changing contract terms in our index rec procurement. Please note that this process is currently being discussed and there is no intention of anything being adopted for the ongoing procurement that's in place for the fall right now. If we do have a formal process going forward, it will be filed with the ICC in February of 2025 and announced which contracts will be affected and when it takes place. So for people participating in the parallel contracting that's going on right now for the fall procurement, please note this process is separate from that. Now that we have all of that out of the way, welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm Chandrika Mittal. I'm the Director of Renewable Energy Financing here at the IPA. I am joined by our Procurement Administrator, NERA Economic Consulting. If anyone from NERA can just say hi and show your face, that would be great so everyone knows you're here.
Hi, everybody. Benjamin Chi from the Procurement Administrators team, NERA representing here on behalf of the IPA. It's good to see everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Before we jump into our discussion topic for today, if everyone does not mind, you have the ability to unmute yourselves. If you could please name the organization you're from, potentially just one person from each organization. If you have multiple people, should suffice. That would be great to know who's in the room today.
Hi, this is Jen Argoti with Ørsted Onshore Americas.
Thanks, Jen.
This is Ryan Scott with Rev Renewables.
Hi, Ryan.
Doug Stinner with RWE.
Hi, Doug.
Hey, Chris Conkle with Apex Clean Energy.
Nice to see you, Chris.
Elizabeth Wheeler with Clean Grid Alliance.
Nice to see you, Elizabeth.
Kathy Dietz with Vistra.
Hi, Kathy.
Billy with Emeren.
Hi, Billy.
Hi, Will Kenworthy with Vote Solar.
Thanks, Will.
Janelle Navratil, ComEd.
Hi, Janelle.
Carol Garth, Ameren, Illinois. We also have Justin Range, Chris Bell, and Megan Allen.
Awesome, thanks.
Charlene Davis with TRC Engineers.
Hi, Charlene. Is there anyone else who did not hear their organization's name?
Hi, it's Vincent Musco at Bates White.
Hi, Vincent. Okay, I think that might be everyone today. Thank you, and if you've been participating in these workshop series, you probably know the discussion we've had so far. If not, I'll share a very quick recap. So the reason we're conducting this workshop process, or what this workshop process is about, IPA currently procures and runs the procurement for our index rec contracts, which is executed with the 3 utilities in Illinois: Mid-American, Ameren, and ComEd. The goal of these procurements is to help Illinois meet its RPS goals. We try to procure for utility scale solar, utility scale wind, and utility scale hydro through these procurements. In the COVID/post-COVID world, we received a lot of requests for modifying our index rec agreements once they were executed. The requests were stemming from the fact that these index rec contracts is usually one of the first steps in the development life cycle for developers that we understand. and is usually executed a few to several years in advance of the project actually being constructed. What happened in the COVID/post-COVID world is the economics that they bid into the procurement with at, let's say, 2021 were no longer feasible or economic in, let's say, 2024 when the project's ready for energization or going through construction. During these challenging times, we received requests to modify the agreements, and currently the IPA does not have a formal process to renegotiate contract terms or to modify these already executed contracts. In order to dive into these challenges, which we understand are still present to date to some extent, we wanted to hold these workshops. We talked about holding these workshops in the long-term renewable resources procurement plan that the IPA publishes every 2 years. The last plan was published earlier this year in April, and the next plan will be published in 2026. There are certain topics that we want to discuss in this workshop process specifically, which are challenges which are related to kind of these economic challenges or other challenges that take place once you have already executed our index reg contract, and let's say the market factors have shifted significantly beyond the developer's control. We certainly want to make sure that the developers have a path to see these projects to fruition. Hence why we want to be as flexible as possible. And that is why we're holding these workshops to understand what are these challenges that everyone faces, that we could potentially either have a formal renegotiation process or talk about other tools that, let's say, other states have adopted on how we can help with this challenge. If there are other comments on our index reg procurement process overall or our contract, you're more than welcome to share those. We are very willing to hear those, but what we're trying to establish through this particular process is to understand specifically what are those post-award challenges. So we're not talking about the time frame while you're negotiating that contract and let's say that 10-day period, which is typical for Illinois. We're talking about once you've already executed your contract and now the market dynamics have shifted considerably. The information that you shared during this workshop is primarily what will form our basis for that compliance filing that we will be filing with the ICC in February 2025. So it is very important to us that if you have these challenges, have experienced these challenges, or are an association who regularly works with developers that faces these challenges, we would love to hear about what those are and what are your proposals or solutions that we could incorporate to make this easier to procure more and more renewables for the state and for you to build your project for the state. I do want to highlight that you have the option to submit confidential feedback. We do realize that some of the information, specifically when it comes to economics of these projects, is very sensitive. It's commercially sensitive information that a lot of developers don't feel comfortable sharing in a public platform. While we understand that need to protect your commercially sensitive data, we also need to have information shared with us, whether confidentially or publicly, in order to make that filing with the ICC so we understand what the challenges are. So you do have an option to submit confidential information via email to me. My email address has been on every announcement we've posted on these workshops. So if that is the route you would like to take, please feel free to share it that way. In terms of workshop logistics, we've allotted 2 hours. We've already held 3 workshops in the past 3 months. This is our 4th workshop. If we are seeing a lot of engagement, happy to go full 2 hours. That's the time we've allotted for this workshop. Before we jump into the topic for this particular workshop, I do want to talk a little bit about what we discussed in the past 3 workshops. So our first workshop, we talked about just general pain points that developers were facing around our index reg contract, specifically related to this post-award period. In the second workshop, we talked about various contract terms that developers find challenging and would like to see some changes, whether it's related to post-award or not related to post-award. We received a lot of great feedback, and we've already executed on some of the feedback that was received into our current procurement cycle in terms of shortfall amounts and other such challenges. In the third and last workshop, we talked about how some of the other states were navigating these challenges, because Illinois certainly was not the only one receiving these requests, given the market dynamics of potentially changing the contract terms or renegotiating the price. The last workshop, we talked about 5 different northeastern states that saw this a lot more on the offshore side, but we also discussed New York, which saw these post-award challenges on the onshore side. We shared some inflation indexing mechanisms that these states adopted in lieu of a formal renegotiation process. My understanding is that was relatively new information for a lot of the folks on the call, and people were absorbing a lot of those strategies that these other states adopted. Now that hopefully folks have had a chance to absorb that information, we wanted to talk about how everyone feels about potentially adopting an inflation indexing or adjustment mechanism in lieu of a formal renegotiation process that we originally started discussing. So that's kind of the big picture question. The elephant in the room for this workshop is, how does everyone feel about these strategies that other states adopted that have gone through this, again, more on the offshore side, some on the onshore side. We can jump deeper into what were these adjustment mechanisms. We have the slides that we used last time where we shared all of this information that we're happy to pull up again and go through the inflation adjustment formula that these other states have, and get into the nitty-gritties of how everyone feels about certain formulas over others, what we think is a good formula as a group, if we were to go to that route. But before we get there, I want to take a deep pause. I want to ask if there's any questions before we go deeper into talking about how everyone feels potentially adopting an inflation adjustment mechanism instead of a renegotiation process. The reason we're doing that, and the reason that other states did not adopt a formal renegotiation process, was similar to what we've talked about in the past. Everyone's concerned about maintaining the integrity of the initial competitive procurement, and that was the reason that none of the other states implemented a renegotiation process and found the inflation adjustment mechanism as a good alternative. So I will pause now if there's any questions. If not, please unmute yourselves and share with me what you think about using an inflation adjustment mechanism.
Hi, this is Jen from Orsted. We would definitely be open to seeing this sort of mechanism, really anything to allow for potential changes that could come up in the gap between when the project was awarded and, if we move further into our development process, and there are certain changes that come up, especially if it was some sort of major tax, related to some sort of executive order. Really just anything to get us more comfortable signing a contract that otherwise doesn't have a lot of room for negotiation. So we're definitely open to looking into this.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a quick question that would help us understand more. I believe Orsted on the offshore side participated in the New York procurement. If you don't mind sharing, and I don't know if you're the right person to know this, what was your experience in dealing with contracts that do have inflation adjustment, and if there's any feedback on the formula that, let's say, New York adopted for both onshore and offshore?
Unfortunately, I was not involved in that one at all. So I don't really have any comments for the offshore side. It's something, separately we could maybe take offline, and I could connect with some of my coworkers who worked on that.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else? If not, I am gonna pull on Elizabeth as you are representing a few of the members if they're not feeling comfortable sharing. Have you heard any feedback, Elizabeth from Clean Grid, on potentially adopting an inflation adjustment mechanism in lieu of a formal contract renegotiation?
Can you hold on 1 second?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No.
I have not heard specifically about that, like an thumbs up or thumbs down proposal on or reaction to doing like a automated adjustment. I do think that our members would be interested in seeing what the proposal is on that, like all things that kind of comes down to what the details are of it. And as you noted, I think on the last workshop, the timing and all of those issues. I think if you come up with the correct formula and use the correct indices for calculating, that would likely get at some of the issues relating to strike price, but that our members are not exclusively interested in being able to adjust the straight price. So they also are interested in being able to adjust other contract terms.
Got it. And we can discuss maybe after we talk about, I guess, challenges more related to strike price on what those contract terms are, if they have not already been discussed or hashed out. We did put in some refreshed contract terms in our current fall procurement, so would be interested if that solved some of the challenges you were hearing. If not, at least would love to be aware of what are these other challenges that your members are seeing.
I think the primary one is rec delivery, just based on the difference between what may be bid in initially and what a project may be able to actually achieve in terms of, if they can get the correct amount of land or if they can build their project to the correct size to deliver the recs that were originally intended under the contract.
Gotcha. Happy to pull in Ben to highlight some of the adjustments we've made in our contract to ease the pressure for shortfall amounts. I think that's what you're talking about in terms of rec delivery. Towards the end of the workshop, Ben, if you don't mind, we can share that just so that everyone knows some of the changes we've made to ease that pressure on the shortfall amounts that Elizabeth touched on. But coming back to the topic at hand, if there's anyone else on the call, if you have feelings on would an inflation adjustment mechanism solve some of these challenges we're talking about regarding project economics in terms of post-award renegotiation requirement or need, I would love to hear more from any of the other developers in the room. If not, has anyone participated in any of these offshore or onshore procurements in the Northeast that have inflation adjustment? And if you have, would you mind sharing your experience or how that process went for you in those states?
So this is Mac Moore with Emrin with a E rather than Emrin with an A, just to make sure we're clear. So the New York onshore concept, was more of a ability to rebid rather than the inflation adjustment mechanism for post-award contracts. So we don't have that familiarity, although open to the concept of the inflation adjustment.
Thank you. I think it might be helpful, Tori, if you don't mind bringing up the presentation just to jog everyone's memory. Given Mac brought up New York, we do have the adjustment formulas that New York used and the rest of the four states here. So I'm just going to quickly pull up and show what we saw in those states. Tori, could you skip to the next slide, please? Perfect. So this is the formula that New York has currently for their land-based renewables or onshore renewables, where they have the auto adjustment. It is currently optional for onshore, not for offshore. They're just using the PPI basically between submission and start of construction. So looking at this is the closest that Illinois has in terms of a reference point for what's working in another state. As far as land-based renewables are concerned, I do want to focus on this and ask potentially again what folks think about something like this to ease some of those economic challenges if Illinois were to adopt that. If any other developers are willing to share either their experience in any of the northeastern states that do have inflation adjustment, or just your thoughts in potentially having an inflation adjustment mechanism in Illinois instead of a renegotiation process. Okay, hearing no active woohoos or nays, I think where we are in terms of process, I think this is the, like I said, closest that we have to what's working in different states. I do want to pull up some of the indices that yes, Chris.
Hey, sorry, I was having a hard time coming off of mute. So one, I think we want to, in this, like, preserve some room for project level renegotiation. There's going to be certain dynamics that are unique to specific projects. I'm namely thinking about interconnection upgrades, and if those are more expensive than anticipated, for example. So I think an inflation adjustment mechanism that's sort of across the board, there could be some value in that, but I don't want to do it at the expense of preserving some space for project level discussions as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Sorry, was there anyone else about to say something?
Hey, this is Jen from Orsted. I did see someone else's hand up. I'm not sure if that went down or not, but I would also second that with those concerns related to transmission upgrades or other major project level costs that just aren't quite determined by the time we have to submit our bid price.
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding correctly, can you highlight outside of interconnection costs and transmission upgrades, what else is potentially one of those that can change significantly to the point of needing to terminate a contract?
This is Ryan. Oh, sorry, you go.
I think another consideration is, one of the items that's been kind of listed as a driver for the need for this is specifically panel supply. And
Mhm.
companies could have different strategies around panel supply and with respect to tariffs or any kind of other trade related issues. That could affect a certain company and their project more so than another, just because of companies have different strategies, different abilities to sign into longer panel supply agreements or things like that. So that's another one that comes to mind. But again, I think the interconnection strategies probably or interconnection costs are probably the biggest one that come to mind for me, at least.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, Ryan, I think you wanted to.
Yeah. No, mine are gonna follow up with Chris. I definitely believe, when you look at inflation, you look at it from a macro perspective, but that's not really project specific risk. So source of supply, if certain sources of supply are taken away from you, it's irrelevant of the macro factors. Then you have to go back to the bottom of the list to resource, which is not a macro factor, but a micro project specific factor to Chris' point. If you're also including batteries here, you have changing rules on what inputs inside of battery systems are allowed. So, and domestic battery supply is not exactly very viable right now or prolific. And the transmission cost is so out of the control of the developer with changing timeframes that it's not a commodity. We're not buying steel here from an index perspective. You're buying project specific attributes.
Thank you. Anyone else, while we're talking about what are these other costs that may not be captured in index that could significantly shift needing to terminate or renegotiate a contract?
I'll add one comment. Doug Stinner from RWE. I've heard to some degree that there's a potential labor shortage of workers for projects, so it may not come about now, but it certainly could be in the future an issue with construction.
So basically cost of labor. Okay.
I think this is just Ryan again, just to iterate, cost is a factor of risk. So as long as there's existing risk in a project that a local community could also deter the project, that is not an indexable risk that you can adjust the price on, but that is a reason a project will die.
Yep, no, absolutely hear you on that. Tori, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to highlight some of the things that were mentioned, not interconnection, but in terms of labor costs or specific to renewables. These are the type of indices we're seeing captured on the offshore side, not really on the onshore side. Again, interconnection and transmission upgrades is its own beast, and we recognize that. But outside of those categories, if Illinois were to consider a more advanced formula that takes into account some of these nuances, like the states on the Northeast do for offshore, would this help at all? Or would a generic PPI commodity type index be kind of the same thing? How much does, let's say, cost of labor or particularly steel, capturing those nuances affect a project compared to, let's say, just using the generic index? Are there any thoughts on that? All I'm trying to understand is if, again, outside of transmission interconnection, if there is a need for an advanced formula, because based on our discussions, with the northeastern states, and we talked to each of the states we talked about last time in the last workshop. New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They all adopted this inflation adjustment mechanism, and only New York has a land-based or onshore adjustment formula, in which New York, based on the feedback that they received in their processes, did not adopt a very nuanced formula, and they adopted a more generic formula. And I'm kind of wanting to enter that discussion again to see if that's the path that people feel does what it's intended to do, or should we be looking at something way more nuanced like we have, like other states have for offshore?
This is Mac Moore at Emory again. And did they give you any guidance about why they chose, for offshore wind to have the more complex formula, but then they adopted the simplistic concept for onshore, wind and solar?
Yeah, I think two parts. One, great question. One, I think for onshore, they were trying to come up for something that solves both solar and wind's challenges, whereas for offshore it was primarily wind. So knowing some of the big I guess component costs and what indices represent those costs is easier to adopt a more nuanced formula, because you're not trying to solve for multiple projects with one formula. You're talking only about wind. And then the second I heard was that some of these components they're used in really high quantities for an offshore project compared to an onshore project. So for example, offshore wind, from what I understand, uses a lot more steel than, let's say, an offshore wind uses a lot more steel than onshore wind project, which is why some of these formulas are trying to solve for these large component buckets that can really change the economics of an offshore project versus for onshore. That's what they told us, that it's not something that was making a huge swing, and the generic formula basically covered those just roundabout inflation that everyone was seeing. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, I guess it was that balance between the complexity, everybody, as we've, been hearing folks talking about project specific issues, right? And trying to come up with a formula that's going to capture every little thing could be pretty complicated versus the simplicity of an index. And I think we would need to run the numbers to kind of see if that would work for us in our individual case. So that we'll have to do that.
Okay, thanks for bringing that to light, because yes, that makes sense, that depending on what level of inflation is being captured by a generic versus a nuanced formula. Anyone else with thoughts on going simple versus advanced?
I have a question. Doug Stinner from RWE. Have you or these organizations run any analysis using these more complicated formulas versus a more generic PPI index over time? Do they converge, or do they separate, or what's essentially the numbers behind this, and to give us some insights?
No, we have not. This is kind of the first time, like I said, Illinois is considering anything like this, and we're, let's say, consider step one of that discussion. Step two would be, if the decision is to use inflation adjustment instead of contract renegotiation, would be to go deeper into analyzing how each of these formulas impact. I'm not sure if the other states did. I can go and revisit some of the notes we have from our conversation, but I think it was a lot of the formula development came from very strong stakeholder feedback, like Illinois is holding right now, on what everyone proposed. And then I think the states themselves modified based on the feedback they received, based on, I do think they ran some analysis to understand what the weighting should be. So you can see most states have some level of weighting in terms of which formula accounts for what percentage. And I think the analysis was done to understand how that weighting should be based on the portion of that component reflecting the cost of a particular offshore wind project. So I think there was a lot of analysis on the weighting. I'm not sure if the indices were primarily just stakeholder feedback or if they did analysis on that as well. I think what we were hoping to see in this discussion is if we had developers that participated in those Northeastern inflation adjusted contracts to see what their experience has been and to learn from that to understand what has been working and what has not been working, if that helps. Anyone else with thoughts on potentially, or if you've been exposed to the Northeastern contracts, or if you have experience or understanding, thoughts on going simple versus advanced? Okay, so I quickly want to run through some of the formulas that we saw in the Northeast, just so that everyone has an idea. Again, these materials are from the third workshop. We shared them in the third workshop, so if it's something you need to reference, the presentation from the third workshop is available on the IPA's downstream negotiation webpage. So if you need to take it back and revisit, you have access to this information. But Tori, could you jump to the next slide, please? So really quickly, that was the formula for New York that we were just looking at. Again, New Jersey opted for something a little bit more simplistic, as we can see. Tori, can we go through the next slide? Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so for Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, you'll see that the formulas look very similar as they decided to hold joint procurements for offshore. The main indices that you can see jumping out for most of these states is your CPI, steel, copper, fabrication, and labor. Some added fuel, some did not. You can see what those indices are, or the data source for these indices. And then Massachusetts also included interest rate as part of their adjustment mechanism formula. Can you go to the next slide, please, Tori? You can see Connecticut is pretty much the same. And then last slide, please, Tori. Okay, and then Rhode Island did something slightly different. And then Tori, can you go back to the New York slide? Thank you. So having looked at the formulas, which were for offshore wind versus for onshore, I am not, from what I'm hearing right now from some of you, is potentially you're going to have to run some analysis and there's no knee-jerk reactions on, yes, a simplistic formula makes sense versus no, we absolutely should have a more nuanced formula. So correct me if my understanding is wrong there, but that's what I am taking away from what I've heard so far. Okay. Some of the next questions in our agenda are talking about these indices. And again, I'm curious if anyone's participated in the Northeastern procurements, if there's certain indices that work better that were used by these other states versus others. Okay, then next question is more going into detail. You can see that a lot of these states have some level of capping for inflation adjustment, because the way the inflation adjustment mechanism works is your project, if partaking in the inflation adjustment contract, can float up or down based on where these indices are that are in the formula. Most states cap it to a 15 or a 16%, which basically means that your strike price or final bid price can adjust up to 15% or 16% or down to 15% or 16%, depending on where these indices land. I am curious if anyone has any strong thoughts on this capping mechanism, and if anyone has any strong thoughts on those percentages, if there is a strong feeling of no, it should only go to 5 or 20, or hey, it should not be capped. If yes, then why? Or if no, then why not? So just curious to see if there's any thoughts on those capping mechanisms that are currently used by these northeastern states that we talked about in the last workshop.
So Mac Moore again from Emory. My initial take, without having run the numbers, would be that a capping mechanism seems to defeat the purpose, right? It's if a project is struggling because of the economic situation in the supply chain or labor has changed, then if it's above and beyond the cap, then it's really not going to help, right? So it seems to me that that's sort of an arbitrary concept that probably wouldn't work so well.
Gotcha. I think the intention, just based on our discussions with the states, was that if the market has shifted so significantly that we're seeing over 15% jump up or down in prices, then maybe the contract should be rebid. That was the intention behind the capping, that if the shift is so large, then maybe there's other factors at play as well. That means maybe just inflation is not at hand, because potentially when you see in a COVID-like environment, you're seeing delays on timeline, you're seeing inventory challenges. So the justification for having some sort of a cap was to say that if the shift is so large that it's moving your price by over 15%, then there's potentially a lot going on in the market, and we should just have a rebidding. So that's Matt, just a little bit of information. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what we learned.
Yeah, and we just, sorry to finish the thought there. So the rebidding is an option that is I think a viable approach that New York went that route as well. But I would say, I mean, one observation is just there are obviously PPA offtake price indices that would kind of support fairly significant changes of the past several years. So I think it's not necessarily project specific issues, but that you could attribute fairly significant swings to market as well, and so that whether the choice is to switch to a rebid or try and stick with the index, I wouldn't say that the justification, that there can very well be, and in fact has been, a very significant uptick in PPA prices that are market wide rather than project specific.
Thank you. Doug, I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when these states implemented these mechanisms for readjusting the price, did they also look at ways for rebidding? Do some adjustment on that, maybe make it easier, or to make it easier for developers to continue in the market?
Yes. So great question. Something we talked about in the third workshop is so some states actually made it easier to rebid, New York being one of them. when there was inflation adjustment implemented. So for that particular round, when they were receiving a lot of termination and requests for renegotiation, this is the process they went with in terms of inflation adjustment. And then they allowed and made it easier for certain developers to rebid who had achieved XYZ in their project timeline or development. However, we also saw the flip side where some states made it actually harder to rebid because their justification was that some of these should have been accounted for by developers, and if you're needing to rebid going forward, that means that potentially the developer missed accounting for some things. So we've seen both sides of the equation where some states took an approach where they made it easier and some states not so much. However, a key difference that I want to highlight between procurements in Illinois versus procurements in the Northeast, specifically in New York, is New York only conducts procurements once a year. The time period between negotiation and execution of the procurement is a few weeks to months, whereas in Illinois, we hold procurements twice a year, so usually spring and fall, which means that basically it doesn't make a lot of sense for Illinois to consider rebidding just because by the time we're set up to, let's say, do a rebid, our next procurement round would be up anyway. So the idea is instead of rebidding, most developers have the opportunity to basically bid twice in Illinois, and they would just bid in the next upcoming procurement since it's every 6 or less months. So that was the reason why other states did do rebidding is again because they hold procurements annually, whereas we hold it twice a year. And then secondly, I do also want to highlight that one key difference in Illinois is the period between the negotiation of the contract between signing and final, or I guess discussing or bidding and final execution is very short. We only have about 10 days. We process applications really quickly. So some of these nuances where rebidding was required or certain mechanisms were required may not necessarily make sense in Illinois, given how often our procurements are and how fast we go from bid to execution. Any follow-up questions on that? If not, the next question, which is, we sort of heard this feedback in this post-award process, but curious to hear what the current group thinks. New York, for land-based renewables, introduced this adjustment mechanism as an optional mechanism, which means you have the option to not have your price be adjusted using these formulas and just have a fixed price. This is only the case for land-based. For offshore, you're automatically enrolled. So all contracts and prices are automatically adjusted for inflation between a certain timeline. So in New York, it's between, I guess, submission and start construction. In some of the other states, we've seen all sorts of different approaches in terms of what that timeline looks like for inflation adjustment. I am curious to hear from this group if everyone feels providing options is somewhat better received by you all, by developers, as opposed to having an inbuilt mechanism for adjusting through this inflation index.
So Mac Moore here again. So I guess to get a little bit into the nuance here, so there's an aspect of adopting the inflation adjustment mechanism in going forward contracts, right? So in that context, you could say, okay, well, you know, the consideration of a post-contract adjustment embedded in the agreement. And then I think the other aspect is the adjusting retroactively for contracts that were been executed. And I think that in New York, they did not do that retroactive, right? It was only on a going forward basis. And so that I think, certainly for us, in our specific situation, it would be important to have a mechanism for a retroactive adjustment, i.e. that the existing agreement would be modified to reflect this and then going forward. So that's I thought an important nuance to discuss.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, you're correct, where I don't think any of the other states implemented this retroactively. It's all for procurements that were conducted in that round and going forward. In terms of Illinois, that's great feedback. I think we do have the ability, if needed, to implement this retroactively. But again, that's something I think we're going to need to discuss and take internally. So appreciate the feedback on that.
It's Doug Stinner from RWE. Another question on this. If New York has the optionality to either opt in or not for this index, do they also use benchmark pricing similar to Illinois in evaluating bids?
I believe they do. Ben, do you have more information? Typically, we've had Graham from New York participate in these conversations when New York specific questions come up, but I don't think I see him on the call today. So just curious, Ben, if you know how their mechanism works.
Yeah, I believe they have a very similar process, Doug, where there is a benchmark in place. And only those that pass the benchmarks are being considered and evaluated.
And then it's probably just one benchmark price, whether you select the optionality or not.
I'm not sure what they do there. I think it's similarly confidential on their side.
Okay.
Yeah, and just one nuance probably I should note is that the large scale RES in New York and similarly in Illinois is that for the land-based projects and certainly for our procurement, there are multiple technologies. It's not just one technology. I don't think this was raised yet, but just keep in mind when we are thinking of streamlining the formulas, we have not just solar, we have wind, hydro, brownfield as well. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for re-highlighting that. I did mention that in the beginning, that one of the reasons why we heard New York was using a simpler formula for land-based was because they were trying to have this formula reflect all technologies that they contract using this mechanism. So yes, Doug, to answer your question, they do have a proprietary benchmark. From what I understand, based on public information, is you typically bid a price which is with the adjustment mechanism, but you're also required to bid a price which is without. So you have to provide two prices, one which is without the adjustment mechanism formula, and if you opt in to use the adjustment mechanism formula, then you provide that benchmark price. How they evaluate those two prices, we don't have insight into. That's, like Ben said, a confidential process. But for almost all of the states that we looked at and talked about in the last workshop, so reminding New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, whenever there has been an opt-in or an option to use inflation adjustment, you are always required to share a price which is without the inflation adjustment as well. So you're basically submitting two prices. Again, any last words or final feedback on if the inflation indexing should be optional or mandatory? If there's any strong thoughts on either one, that would be great to hear. Okay. I think one more question as we evaluate potentially adopting an inflation adjustment mechanism instead of a renegotiation mechanism is to understand what folks think could be a good adjustment date. I think this is something Elizabeth brought forward earlier, and we've seen a range of mechanisms adopted on that front, where for some of the states we've seen that the process of adjusting is typically between the contract execution or bid proposal and commencement of construction. For some states, we saw that it was a defined time period, so 1 year from execution. For some states, it's based on financial close, so between execution and financial close for the project. Are there any thoughts on what a good adjustment date would be based on what you all know about project development? What would be the most impactful if we were to have inflation adjustment? What would that time period be for the project's price to be automatically adjusted?
This is Mac at Emerald. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I think one other factor would be to come up with something that is easy to measure and, very specific. A date, the start date, obviously, is it as of submittal? That probably seems to make the most sense. And then the end date, I have to think about that, but that, again, something that's simple and isn't subject to interpretation, I think would be important.
When you say that, are you saying simple as in an X amount of time period between bid submission and end date for implementation, or are you saying simple in the sense of a defined milestone in development, so like energization or construction start or financial close?
Yeah, so I think it's the latter, and that, for each individual project, there can be nuances that you'd have to consider. What if there isn't any financing at a balance sheet type of construction? What if the the details of a construction contract, what it's defined as notice to proceed or start of construction, those types of things, can get a little bit complicated. So, I don't have a clear answer there, but I think that's what I had in mind.
No, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And yes, absolutely understand how there can be a lot of gray areas when we specifically are talking about development milestones. I think that's why we saw some of the states steer clear of that and just implement an X amount of years from bid proposal. But again, that may or may not solve the purpose. I personally think if we are setting an arbitrary timeline instead of linking to a project milestone. So just curious if anyone else has any thoughts on kind of that adjustment date or time period.
Hey, this is Elizabeth Wheeler with Clean Grid. I think we would be supportive of a time period that is tied to projects rather than tied to a fixed amount of time, just for the reasons that you stated, Chandrika.
Yep, that makes sense. Do you have any feedback on what that milestone should be?
I think generally our members were thinking start of construction, but understood and agreed that could be murky. So it would be good to get more feedback on what that exactly means, or have some clear milestones and guidance on that.
Makes sense. I think I saw maybe Alejandro's hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Elizabeth said. I think arbitrary timelines don't often make sense in light of what you said. I think for the project base, and I think, again, I'll reiterate, I think start of construction is one that we've heard in our team makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's sort of like a drop dead, like you want to know before you put a shovel in the ground. And I don't know if that's definitely not the definition of what start of construction is that I'm trying to throw out, but just from a conceptual point of view, I think that's the place that said, you know, that would be like the backstop if it, you know, ideal.
Gotcha. So throwing it back to all of you, what do you define as start of construction in your projects? What is that? What does that mean to you?
I would say on our end, I'd want to check with our team just to see how they define that term. I think that could be vary, but that's something I think everyone probably could come up with and give you a general sense. So I'll mute myself now.
That would be great. Yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on how you define internally start of construction, that would be really helpful. And we would ideally want to come up with that definition together, as we've tried to do through this whole process. So again, if anyone has strong feelings as to how they implement start of construction or define, I would love to hear it, what you think within your organizations. Is there a certain milestone that's passed which absolutely is considered start of construction by basically the least gray area is what I'm trying to discover here. So if there's any, please share with me. Alejandro, since you were the last one, if you don't mind maybe sharing after you talk internally how you guys define start of construction, and same for other folks on the call, it would be really helpful just to see the differences between how everyone defines it and see what might work best. And that could be something we could discuss in our next workshop.
We can do that. Yep, definitely.
Thank you. Another question on inflation adjustment that we haven't seen anything capture this clearly, and I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts, is tariffs. I want to say someone at the beginning of this discussion talked about it through either executive orders or otherwise. There are some tariffs that have been looming and upcoming that are already in place. Is there a sense for what might capture tariffs best in a formula like this? We have not seen any of the northeastern states particularly capture that, so which is why we're trying to understand if folks on the call have any thoughts on how can we best account for tariffs. Any ideas?
Mackmore again. So no clear answer there. I mean, I think this gets back to that, you know, the simplicity versus the project specific and market specific issues. Those that obviously affect certainly the solar world, batteries, modules. I don't know so much about wind. That would not be captured in a producer price index, right? So that would then push in the direction of a more complicated formula tied to modules or other components. It is a factor, obviously driving pricing in our industry, but whether it gets too complicated, that's, I guess, the key question.
Thanks, Mac.
This is Ryan. I kind of support what Max says there. Putting into a formula does not account for project by project differences, and I know this may not what you want to hear, but like projects can have domestic produced modules, they can have internationally produced modules, they could have modules that are already warehoused in the United States, they can have them that are going to be delivered. You can have a mix of manufactured modules. It's not every solar facility is like this. So you could have a project that has a 70-30 split of all different types, 50-50. So what you're gonna do is you may drive some pricing and behavior you don't want by having it defined this way. If what you're looking for is project success.
Mhm.
So that's one of the concerns I would have, is that it may not give you exactly what you want.
You mean accounting for tariffs may not get us? Is that
I'm saying like carte blanche formulaic accounting for tariffs, like tariffs are omnipotent across all projects and the same.
Gotcha. That's helpful. And you're right, it does not help me account for some of these factors that we're trying to solve through a formulaic adoption. So just curious if there is a possibility to capture that, or if folks are pretty much, I think what I'm hearing is there is no way to capture that potentially.
And this is just Ryan. In my prior experiences with formulaic equations and master agreements, they work in commodity areas. So yes, if we were building steel structures, if we were building even the inputs to a solar facility, if we were building transformers, they could be utilized for a percentage of the costs. But when you're doing a construction project, you know, it's very different than building a manufactured item.
Yep.
So
Thanks, Ryan. Anyone else has any ideas on how to account for tariffs without needing to terminate or renegotiate? Okay. Me either. So hopefully we'll figure this out together. I think one of the last questions, Tori, if you don't mind pulling up the agenda again, please. Thank you. I think one of the last questions on here for this particular topic, when we're talking about inflation adjustment, is if folks have any idea on how can we track regional cost information. And I think this touches on that labor piece a little bit, where again, in this workshop process, we've heard feedback how labor costs can vary potentially significantly between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. I am curious to hear experiences on that, and if there's a way to track regional cost information, and potentially bake in some of those movements in the inflation adjustment as well. Seems a lot more nuanced and tricky based on what we've tried to explore, but again, I'm curious if anyone has any ideas on tracking regional cost information.
It's Doug Stinner, RWE. I believe Bureau of Labor Statistics has some regional information, but I don't know to what extent they have it for states or just regions of the country, and to what level of detail. But there is some information out there.
Thank you. Yes, I think that information based on what I looked at was more regional in terms of state, but not within state. So unless I'm missing something, or is that the understanding that others have as well, I would love to hear any other ways to track regional information within a state. Okay. I want to go back to two things we talked about in the beginning of this workshop. One, I want to touch on something that Elizabeth, you brought forward on the rec delivery. So Ben, would you mind highlighting some of the changes we've made in our current fall contract based on the feedback we received from this workshop, as well as in our index rec procurement stakeholder feedback process as well? So again, Ben, if you don't mind highlighting some of those changes specifically on the rec shortfall that we've done, so that everyone understand some of these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks,
Thank you.
Chandrika. As well as Elizabeth who raised the question. So this is a question that's been raised multiple times about how do you deal with if there are shortfalls. So maybe I'll very quickly just talk about the standard that and what the flexibilities are under the contract and what and highlight just changes that have been made for those who are joining us and not familiar with what the flexibilities are. So under the contract, there is a defined term known as a delivery year requirement, which is more or less the annual quantity proportionally allocated to a particular utility that you bid on. That delivery year requirement is something that you bid on and adjusted for a degradation factor or rate that you indicate. And that's basically sets the baseline for what we expect you to deliver in a particular delivery year period that runs from June through May. So it becomes an event of default in prior contracts if you miss more than 3 times this delivery year requirement across the term of the entire contract tenor. And if the shortfall amounts in aggregate exceeds or equal or exceeds the annual quantity under the contract. This has since been moved through the long-term plan and more recently through the workshop comments as well to become 5 or more times that you cannot miss, not just 3 or more, and also 2 times the aggregate shortfall amounts, not just one times the annual quantity amount. So, we have moved close to double what we have started with. If you have participated in prior procurements last year, this is where we are right now. And also moving from the stop period plus the first year being excuse of all shortfall amounts to now become the stop period up through the first 2 full delivery years. So if you don't start on June 1st, there is a stop period up front. And that means that potentially 2 years and the entire stop period will not be counted towards shortfall amounts. That's also a change or an enhancement from prior years. The other flexibilities remain the same, such as, there's no prohibition on size changes. And the new things, once it is energized, that we have made, I think 2 other accommodations recently made for this procurement is curtailments. Under the force majeure requirements now, all types of curtailments that are not primarily initiated by you, the seller, would or could count towards force majeure events that may be excused from any shortfalls, not of your own. And also, if you do end up in a situation where there is an event of default under normal circumstances, there is now also a waiver process for the IPA to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. So if there are long-term weather changes that are unexpected, then you could make a request for the IPA to look at this, but you need to substantiate these long-term weather changes that do occur, as well as other types of events that may be totally out of the control of seller. So I think those are the big items that we have since incorporated into the contracts. Please look at the red lines that have been posted online if you want to get a very quick glance of the new changes from this round versus what was in summer. You can also look at the summer procurement contracts to see what have been made since the long-term plan has been updated and issued earlier this year. So I think that sort of encapsulates big picture, some of the accommodations that we have implemented in this most recent round.
Thanks, Ben. I see a question from Alejandro asking that these changes are basically for 2024 contracts and going forward, so fall 2024 and going forward, and not retroactive. That's correct, right?
That is absolutely right. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ben, for highlighting some of those flexibilities. Really appreciate it. I
You're
have dropped a link in the chat for everyone to go see the red line that Ben talked about. That is the link that holds all the final materials for the 2024 fall procurement, so current procurement, and you can see some of the contract changes here as well. So I do want to clarify one thing, Ben. When you say 2 times the quantity amount, I think the math that we ran was basically that translates into almost a 10 or 11% shortfall annually, correct?
That is right, and in fact could be a little bit more, given that the first 2 full delivery years and the start period really do not count towards any shortfall amounts.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, just to get back to that question where you were talking about potential rec deliveries, some of the conversations that we had during this workshop process, and we realized that I think a key challenge for Illinois is we've been set up to procure a certain amount of recs. So it's not, unfortunately, the contract is not tied to generation. You bid in a certain number of recs, which means that we're asking you what number of recs you want to bid into the process, and then we hold you to that. Some of the flexibilities, and we understand that, which is what Ben was highlighting, that there are potentially weather changes or things which are out of a developer's control as far as maintaining the generation goals. If sun is not shining, I agree, there's nothing you can do as a developer. So keeping those things in mind, we have tried to incorporate, while switching to a generation-based contract would be a complete overhaul of our procurement. We understand that's something that's favored by most parties, given there are things that are out of a developer's control in terms of generation, but we are trying our best in the way we are set up right now. And one of those allowances is that we've allowed for a 2 times shortfall amount, which basically translates to about 10 or 11% year-over-year shortfall, which what we've seen in the private markets in terms of PPAs, usually there's some sort of 85% production guarantee, so that's a 15% shortfall. So that's something we were trying to get to, is for our state contracts to be able to compete with the private market to some extent, to allow for that level of shortfall. That's basically the updates to the rec delivery contract that Elizabeth, you brought up in the initial part of our conversation.
It's Doug Stinner. One clarifying question as far as delivery goes. If when the RFP is done, a developer puts in an estimate that they're going to develop a 100 megawatt project, but let's say either the land that they ultimately acquire is more or less, can that annual delivery get changed based on some change in the size of the project?
I don't think so. That's what we hold you to. So we are not asking for a certain size of the project. We are only asking for a certain amount of recs that you think you could deliver, which basically translates to, yes, your size can change, but you will need to do some math on your end to accommodate some of these changes. If the project changes in size, maybe bid what you are sure of in terms of the number of recs that you'll be able to provide. So no, there is no ability to change the number of recs once you contract and tell us how much you'll be sharing with that or putting in the contract. But we do allow you to change the project size. Does that make sense? I do want to talk a little bit about, Ben, I think the waiver process that we put in, I think currently only accounts for the weather changes or shortfall. I am curious if that is something that developers could developers bring forward interconnection cost changes or transmission changes through that process? Ben, I see you're unmuted, but I don't.
Yeah. Hi,
Okay.
Chandrika, sorry. Yeah, so the waiver process is a process when an event of default or potential event of default has been triggered, and someone comes and for a review for external circumstances beyond its control. I think that's what it is for. Interconnection issues probably occurs way upfront in the development phase and less on the delivery phase. So interconnection issues, I think currently it's a risk that has been allocated to supplier and not to the buyer. So the suppliers are to at this time bear that risk of interconnection changes. So that's something that we can look into. In terms of a close cousin, I think you touched on tariffs earlier, or any government action, for example, that could occur in the development phase. We do have a process, if you look into the government action section of the contract, that speaks to the fact that if there are changes that materially affects your project, and in particular the development of your project, to such an extent where no commercially reasonable actions taken by the developer would cause us to be compliant, that there is an out for developers in that scenario where you could, where developers could look into that. But that requires a termination of the contract and a rebidding process after. They are free to rebid if they do terminate due to such circumstances. But there must be a demonstration of how the government action has affected the economics in such a way that it has exceeded something called a commercially reasonable threshold under the contract.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Before we get into next steps, are there any other questions that anyone else wants to bring up that we either haven't touched upon, or any last thoughts on Illinois adopting a similar strategy to the northeastern states, where we try to capture some of these economic market challenges through an inflation adjustment mechanism instead of a renegotiation? I do understand that we haven't really talked about or kind of agreed upon how to capture that interconnection and transmission costs that can significantly change. And I, at this point, don't have an answer for how we can best navigate or manage or help with that. But outside of that, in terms of market changes, in terms of inflationary changes, or supply chain challenges, I think that's what we were thinking about when we saw what other states were doing and considering adopting a similar mechanism. So I am curious if that's something that anyone else has any last thoughts on in terms of adopting something like that instead of a formal renegotiation. Okay. We didn't have any questions submitted in advance of this workshop that we need to talk about or that we will be posting, but I do want to highlight that our next and last workshop, this was a 5-workshop process. We are in current workshop number 4. Workshop number 5 is set for December 2nd. It was originally set for November 25th, so we've been doing this typically last Monday of every month, but given the last Monday in November is the week of Thanksgiving, we anticipate holding the 5th workshop on December 2nd. A week or two prior to the workshop, we publish the agenda and send out our announcement for announcing the last workshop. In the last workshop, our goal is to capture everything that's been discussed in the 4 workshops with a summary of what we think we would be doing as far as a post-award process is concerned to alleviate some of these economic challenges. And we hope to have feedback on that direction that we'll be taking from our stakeholders like you prior to putting in our compliance filing in February of 2025. Between workshop number 5 and compliance filing, we will probably put out a draft of what we intend on filing with the ICC, and you'll have your standard feedback process where everyone will have a chance to submit their formal comments to that process or to that summary. And then we'll try to incorporate and respond to those comments before putting in our final compliance filing, I believe, February 17th of 2025. So that's all for today. We will post the summary, the recording, and the presentation from today's workshop in a couple weeks, when we will also announce the agenda and timing of the last workshop. If there's any other questions, I'll still be here for a minute or two. If not, I really appreciate you being on the call today and for sharing your feedback. It's truly very valuable for us, and we want to be as flexible as possible and incorporate most of these solutions that we can to help alleviate some of these challenges, to help Illinois meet its RPS goals, and to see more vulnerables on the Illinois grid. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Chandrika.
Thanks, Mac.
Thank you.
Thanks. Seeing no other questions, Tori, I think we're good to close down. Thank you so much, everyone.